Excellencies, colleagues, partners, good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event organized jointly by the European Union, the Kingdom of Spain, and the Joint SDG Fund at the margins of the high-level political forum. My name is Lisa Kerbiel. I'm the proud head of the Joint Fund Secretariat, and we aim to close the financing gap to achieve the SDGs through systemic action by the UN system, partner governments. Given the COVID-19, there's never been a greater time to explore how we can work together for systemic transformation and shape the way public and private financing can help us build back better and greener and achieve the SDGs. Before I begin my presentation, it's an honor for me to introduce our esteemed panelists. We are joined today by Mr. Felix Fernandez-Shaw, Director of International Cooperation and Development Policy of the European Commission, Ambassador Maria Bassols of the Kingdom of Spain, Courtney Rattray of the Permanent Mission of Jamaica, Ms. Ahuna Ezeakonwa, UNDP Assistant Administrator and Director of the Regional Bureau for Africa, and Mr. Jean-Paul Adam, Director of Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management from the UN Economic Commission for Africa. We are also joined by our esteemed moderator, Mr. Mahmoud Mohuddin, the Secretary General Special Envoy on Financing the 23 Agenda. Secretary General for financing the 2030 Agenda, the ongoing reform of the UN development system, and with it, the Joint SDG Fund present a historic opportunity to advocate for change, curb inequalities, and invest in building resilience and sustainable development. Committed to supporting a cohesive and coherent UN system under the leadership of resident coordinators, the Joint SDG Fund is investing in supporting governments to accelerate their progress towards the SDGs. Our investments take two forms. Firstly, shown here as component one, by enhancing sustainable financing strategies and investments across regions and countries. And secondly, by seizing potential financial innovations, new technologies through a deal pipeline of SDG investments that provide equitable access to finance, which you can see here referred to as component two. This funds historic $60 million investment in 62 joint programs that will offer pragmatic solutions to the world devastated by the COVID-19 crisis. As you can see, this investment includes 23 least developing countries, 10 small island developing states, with 40% of our allocations across the African continent and 21 million of co-funding from development banks and other partners. Considering the SDGs as a policy vaccine against COVID-19, these investments will address the reduced fiscal space to align with the SDGs amidst COVID-19 recovery and financial planning, while co-creating a new generation of risk-sensitive and responsive integrated national financing frameworks. And why? On your left, all to create the enabling conditions and capacities for the alignment of public and private capital for the SDGs. Some of these activities listed on your right, assessments and feasibility studies. We have multiple stakeholder platforms. We again have these building blocks called financing frameworks to incorporate how planning and budgeting will help achieve the SDGs. And finally, we're going to strengthen capacities of all critical stakeholders, public and private, to ensure that we can implement these plans over time. A few country examples. In Morocco, they'll focus on human capital development and socio-economic inclusion, while in Gabon, they'll support their transition from an oil-based economy to a green energy investment hub. Ecuador will focus and target child malnutrition and its impact on the country's wider SDG targets, while Samoa will unpack public, private, and blended financing as they look at blue bonds and other mechanisms with the private sector. Now at the overview of the portfolio, see that over 80% of the 62 joint programs, in fact, are integrated national financing frameworks, with the next theme or focus being gender equality, ensuring that needed resources are reaching vulnerable groups, including women, adolescents, and children. We have 14 of our joint programs looking at the impacts of climate change, 4 strengthening educational systems, and 2, again, looking at chronic malnutrition. You can see the trends in transparency and accountability, leaving no one behind, et cetera, on your right. Moving on to component 2, you recall I mentioned there was a second component, the deal pipeline. This is where we see blended finance leveraging new funding streams to reach the SDGs. And why? Because we believe and we seek to demonstrate that UN facilitated and government-led financing solutions can bring in both public and private monies. Yes. And how? We want non-prescriptive public and private financing solutions, new products, new approaches to really leverage investments into large-scale projects on the ground in the countries that need it most. And as you can see, our intention is to seed or invest up to $10 million per project. This is inclusive of technical assistance, seed money, preparatory funding, and invest in those initiatives in order to de-risk them to attract other partners along and to promote and capture the attention of sustainable investors around the world. As you can see here, we had an unprecedented response to our call for proposals. This was back in December. And by the end of March, we had received 155 concept notes from 105 UN country teams. Thus far, we've weeded that 155 down to the top 28. And this is what you're seeing now, current due diligence underway. The total seed money requested is 216 million with an average request of 7.7 million. You can see the regional balance on your bottom right. And of course, again, that we are in fact including LDCs, SIDS, conflict and fragile affected states in this portfolio. So what are some of the solutions that we're speaking about? And you can see, we'll start on the upper left. We have resilient infrastructure, from water and power grids to economic transformation and waste management systems. Moving down to the lower left, we look at gender and health related interventions, whether they be a social impact bond or an investment strategy for sustainable farming and nutrition enhancement. Agriculture and food security is another theme where we have the financing of smallholder farmers, rural development, nutrition enhancement, and your upper right, looking at natural ecosystems and climate change. How can blue and green financing solutions be part of our portfolio? Here are some country examples again, looking at Barbados, which is looking for a financing facility across the Caribbean for financial expansion. Rwanda and Malawi looking at ways to finance infrastructure in the case of Rwanda for the delivery of primary health care in a sustainable and environmental way with solar power. And finally, Fiji with investments in the coral reefs and looking at blue bonds and other ways to support their blue economy across the Pacific. In conclusion, one of the key takeaways from mornings like today is the critical need for partnerships to elevate the Joint SDG Fund, but the entire UN system into this new world. And interest on a panel like can help build the network that we need to reach the critical partners. We need to be innovative in how we explore other global vehicles that are far outside the UN and outside the Joint Fund for those strategic partnerships. We need to look at academic institutions for research and support with advocacy. We need help from OECD countries, from DFIs, impact frameworks. And finally, we're looking to build a group of friends around each of these projects and launch a virtual roadshow at this year's General Assembly. So with that, I'll stop and I'll pass over to our esteemed moderator, Mr. Muhyiddin, to begin the panel discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Very good presentation, and I think it will provide lots of good suggestions for reactions as well by our esteemed. Good morning and good afternoon, you all. I'm very grateful for the opportunity availed to me by Lisa and her team to moderate this session. I congratulate her for the excellent selection of the panelists today. I can see that beyond the very extensive history of achievement for each one of them. Each selection has an interesting story behind it on involvement on the SDGs and the formulation of the priorities, and indeed a very important role today each panelists have in the response and the recovery efforts after the COVID-19 crisis and its associated implications on the economic and social lives. So I have a target that I need to reveal to all of you, that we need to finish on time, which is never a good issue for a panelist to handle. That means that I may need to intervene if we are going beyond the time for each of the speakers. I hope as well to make it as conversational as possible, this discussion today. And let's aim that we need to finish 5 minutes to the hour. So we have some good time then for all of you to intervene, share reflections, give guidance to the SDG fund, the Joint SDG Fund, which is being described now, and it stands for very interesting descriptions of its functions as a catalyst, as a muscle, as a convener, and sharing knowledge and ideas. This all goes beyond finance. In addition, of course, to funding. But we'll have no better than the panelists to take us in a quick understanding of what's happening in their own domain and how to link that to the activities of the fund and the topic of the panel today. I know that there were some last minute changes, so we'll get them one by one, but I'll take then the first speaker today in the panel, Felix Fernandez Shaw, who definitely in need of no introduction. So Felix is.
Good morning to all in New York. Good afternoon to all of us here, and also some people listening from Africa I've seen, but from other parts of the world. Thanks a lot, Lisa and Mahmoud, to bringing us together in this panel in the HLPF. And also, as we were saying at the beginning, it's good to see so many friends and PRs and friends, with whom we have discussed a several number of times about these issues. I know that we need to be brief, so I will try to give 2 or 3 pills about the work we're doing. The first pill is the UN high-level event that Ambassador Rattray and Canada have organized with the UN Secretary General, and you, Mahmoud, Maria, we're all into that. What we need to understand is the unprecedented amount of public financing we're going to put in the whole world. We, meaning humanity. We're going to put on the table an enormous amount of money that will probably be borrowed from future generations. And the future generations, my kids, in 30 years' time, they will tell me, I'm still paying for what you asked. Everybody's kids will ask that. And we need to tell them, we paid, we borrowed, you're paying so that you have a future. We're buying the future, we are building back. And this future needs to be greener, it needs to be digital, and it needs to be fair. And this is what we're doing today. By doing this video conference, I think we're already saving tons of CO2 emissions in this HLPF. I wonder if someone at the UN could maybe do the accounting. But also, those of us who are immediately connected to this VTC, we are connected to a world conversation. They do not have access to the broadband connection, or don't have the understanding or the training to deal with this stuff, are going to be excluded. And that is going to be a massive problem in terms of social inequalities, together with climate change. So what we probably need to do is we need to look at this from we need to change path. We need to start investing in new things that will take us back to the future and not back to the past. And this is where I think is becoming very important, because we need not only those public finances, we need the private sector, we need a whole of society. And that's where I would really want to make the link with not only what we're doing in Europe. As you know, this is the week and next week where Europe is discussing the new generation EU instrument and the proposal to issue joint debt here in Europe to relaunch, to recover. But we're all strong in that takes the twin green and digital transitions and to build a fairer and more resilient society. And it brings the public finances and the private sector together to participate into that. This is why we have been very strong backing the UN and LISA and others in the Joint SDG Fund, but also back the World Bank and the IMF to work together on integrated national financing frameworks. This is a key technical, but a key piece of the puzzle, because it's important to understand where each country is sitting as regards its financial resources, its financial situation, particularly now in COVID, where everything's down. For one reason or another, everything's down. The remittances, foreign direct investment, tax collection, domestic resource mobilization, South-South cooperation, ODA. I think we're all going. We need to understand how a country understands for itself its own financial resources. Where does it strategize to grow and to recover back? And in that context, how can the rest of us be helpful and be supportive in that regard? Is it public financing? Is it debt sustainability? Is it private sector investment? Is it de-risking the big investor funds that are looking for places to invest and they're not finding them? Probably because they're not looking in the right places, or probably because the right places are not showing what's on offer. We need to bring all these people together, and we need to push them and to push the market to provide all this future. In order to do that, I think it'd be very good if all of us, like we're also doing it in Brussels with the European semester, if we could really have a snapshot and a bit of country on where they are, who they want to go, both in terms of policies and of financing those policies. Thanks a lot, Mahmoud.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Felix. And perhaps if we have time, given that we see the emphasis on recovering better through a variety of initiatives coming from Europe and from the European Commission, and with all appreciation to the independence of the European Central Bank, but all of us may have seen the front page of the Financial Times today with Madame Lagarde emphasizing the green bonds and the role of the SDGs as well, and adherence to the Paris Agreement into all of that. But we'll be coming back to you shortly. Some last-minute changes. I'm very happy to have the distinguished representative from Spain, the Deputy Permanent Representative, Maria Bassos. Ms. Bassos, can you take the floor, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Yes, I am stepping in for Gabriel Ferrero, our Director General for Sustainable Development Policies. And I will try to do my best. I was asked to do this an hour ago, and I will try to do my best to deliver the messages he has sent me today for this meeting. Over the last decade, combined and aligned finance instruments have demonstrated how joint work by the United Nations systems and new financing approaches can help break down silos, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and inclusive and transparent governance. Spain is a very strong advocate of this approach. We are very pleased to see that the lessons from the experience of the last MDG Fund and its continuation to the SDG Fund have been considered and sort of taken to the next level. The lessons learned have demonstrated the enormous ability of UN development system to articulate, I would even say reinvent, and put together its capacity, knowledge, and added value when it works as a coherent and aligned system to achieve common objectives and thus significant results. 2 years ago, 2018, SMAE made a contribution of $10 million from the unused funds to the new SDG Fund. And during the UNGA in September 2019, last year, the president of our government announced a contribution to the Joint SDG Fund of 100 million euros during the next 5 years. This is how big our commitment to the fund and what you're doing here is. We are convinced that complex problems can always be better addressed through a truly integrated and collaborative approach. There is no doubt that the Joint SDG Fund is and will continue to be essential in articulating a medium-long response to the socio-economic impact that this current COVID-19 crisis, which we are all suffering, is causing. And also to accelerate progress towards the SDGs in a moment like we're living today, at the beginning of this decade of action, in which we have already identified serious gaps towards achieving each and every one of the SDGs. The COVID-19 is affecting very hard the world's poorest and most vulnerable, with very important, and Felix referred in part to this or indirectly to this, important multidimensional and intergenerational implications for everybody, but most especially for vulnerable families. As demonstrated some years ago in the 2008 financial crisis, countries with very strong social protection and basic services system suffered less and recovered faster. Thus, strengthening public policies and social protection systems should be, for all of us, a priority in the coming months. The document, a UN framework for the immediate socio-economic, page. The document, a UN framework for the immediate socio-economic response, already points that way, and very rightly so. It points to social protection as one of its streams of work to articulate a socioeconomic response for this crisis. The UN development system is the world's largest international actor on social protection and basic services. And the Joint Fund is an extremely valuable response instrument, which makes available to all countries the extensive experience of all entities that constitute it to expand and strengthen social protection services. The joint response strategy of the Spanish cooperation system to the crisis, to this COVID-19 crisis, we have just very recently approved. In this joint response, Spain considers the Joint SDG Fund as one of the key elements to support efforts aimed at ensuring global coordination at the highest level under the leadership of the UN Secretary General. Let me end by stating once again Spain's firm commitment to the Joint Fund, as well as our support to reorientation of 20% of its programs in the field of social protection approved in December 2019 to respond to the pandemic. Without a doubt, this fund is a strategic and unique mechanism to articulate an effective response to COVID-19 crisis in the decade of action that we are beginning. And let me finally end on a bright note by announcing that very soon, hopefully, you will be receiving at the fund a 5 million contribution to it for this year. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much. This is great news. I smile on Lisa's face with the last words being spoken by you. Thank you so much, and many thanks to you and Felix for the support as well and leadership of the work led by Jamaica and Canada and the Secretary General on financing in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. And I see you very active and very important discussion groups, co-leading them in partnerships with other countries to the right direction, giving us menus of options for the ministerial meeting that is going to be taking place in September, on the 8th of September. And that will be a state meeting as well in September as well on that. So we thank you for your support and your guidance and your leadership. So this gives me a nice introduction to Ambassador Courtney Rattray. I don't know if he had enough of me or not, but there is no one day passed without a meeting or a call, especially during the last few days in the intensive preparations for the discussion groups, along with his partner in this great cause, the Ambassador of Canada, Marc-Andre. Courtney, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Good morning to you. Good morning to Lisa, to all the panelists and everybody listening. The first point that I would make is that recovering better and greener will mean both ensuring that the emergency COVID-19 risk to also support medium and long-term sustainable development, and that we also address structural development challenges in our countries. And I'm speaking from the perspective of a developing country mostly. Most prominent among our challenges are financing, which are often considered the main constraint to progress. The difficulty circumstances that we face require multilateral cooperation, including responding to the global recession in a coordinated way while addressing climate change. But multilateral action is no substitute for national leadership and ownership. Countries must take the lead nationally. In fact, the Addis Agenda makes clear that each country has primary responsibility for its own economic and social development. And so the role of national policies and development strategies cannot be overemphasized. Developing countries have been understandably focused on the means and the mobilization of financing. But financing is not just about resource mobilization. It is also about understanding the characteristics of different types of finance. So I am in full agreement with the effort to promote the development of integrated national financing frameworks, which Felix mentioned a short while ago, as a mechanism for countries to strengthen their development financing policies. These frameworks can facilitate a more long-term risk-informed approach to financing, which can enhance countries' ability to build back better. That said, this is my personal view, obviously, in the over 60 countries that are implementing these frameworks had stress tested them to determine the impact that a black swan event like COVID-19 would have on integration. The Joint Fund could support SIDS in addressing the challenges exacerbated by COVID-19 by providing funding to support them to build back and develop risk-informed, sustainable financing solutions for their national sustainable development strategies. One of the main challenges for SIDS is to attract greater private investment. To do so, we must work to strengthen our national enabling business environment, including achieving and maintaining macroeconomic stability, developing efficient infrastructure services, strengthening our public debt management capabilities, and improving our legal and regulatory frameworks. While we have made strides in strengthening our business environment, much is left to be done. For example, no Caribbean country ranks among the top 50 best places globally to do business. And the perceived infrastructure quality gap between developed and least developed countries has grown, not shrunk, over the last decade. We also need to strengthen our institutional capacity climate-informed infrastructure plans and translate them into quality investment pipelines. This has been a focus of the work that I've been involved in through the Group of Friends of SDG Financing. Over the past 2 years, we have staged a series of retreats for public officials from developing countries, where executives from private investment firms have provided them with the technical support required to properly structure their infrastructure projects. The goal has been to transform them from mere investment opportunities to bankable projects. The idea is that once they achieve bankability, they could then access the liquid high-grade bond portfolios of institutional investors. This would be done while making the best use of public credit, as both private and public resources must be combined to achieve the risk-return ratio required to maximize the development impact. What I am seeing is a systemic need for the development of an infrastructure asset class, where pooled and standardized just at the national level, but across various DFIs. Investor participation could be scaled up by packaging these investments into large, liquid, diversified securitized assets that institutional investors would be able to access. That said, our development challenges obviously do not relate to the need to attract investments in public infrastructure projects solely. Another critical area is for financing to develop our SME sector, which is the driving force of our economies. SIDS need help in developing venture funds, including those that can bring together public and private investment. These funds can mobilize the additional equity financing needed to support innovative startups that lack the capital to move to the next level. In Jamaica, although we have made forays into the venture capital business, there has been no sustained development of the industry due to a number of factors, among the absence of an environment conducive to long-term private capital development. The Joint Fund can help SIDS by providing funding to support the establishment of an ecosystem conducive to venture capital development. A key aspect of this ecosystem development is the establishment of an appropriate legal and regulatory framework for venture capital and private equity. Now more than ever, developing countries need to be able to implement targeted, cost-effective, smart policies to attract finance in investment, create decent jobs, raise living standards, and build back better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And now let me give the floor to Ms. Ahuna Isyakunwa, the UNDP Assistant Administrator and Director of the Regional Bureau for Africa. Ahuna is joining us today with a great deal of experience in not just in her current position, but in being in the field for many years, dealing with many challenges in the humanitarian field, in the economic development, and in the partnerships as well that she made in order to fulfill the objectives of her work. The UNDP has an important role, as we know, in the response and recovery measures, and in the implementation of the framework of the socio-economic measures supported and guided by the Secretary General. We thank you for being with us, and we commend the work of the UNDP through your presence with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud, for that, and greetings to all excellencies and distinguished participants. In the early stage of the pandemic, African finance ministers called for a $100 billion emergency economic stimulus package to address the immediate impact of COVID-19 in Africa. The ministers also advocated for a waiver of all interest payments on external debt, which would save roughly $44 billion in 2020. The total price tag for post-COVID recovery across Africa is, however, expected to be much higher. Africa's traditional financing sources are expected to be constrained in the post-COVID era. And this is why the Joint SDG Fund is particularly timely and also relevant. And the fund, as we heard earlier from Lisa, is really designed to catalyze, galvanize, and leverage public, multilateral, and private sector resources to support countries. Its successful implementation is really one that demands a one UN approach. The UNCT in each country must work assiduously to focus and coordinate the generation, allocation, utilization, and monitoring of these funds. And I want to maybe highlight 4 specific areas, messages that I think will be important to bear in mind. The first, is to burnish the UN system's position as a norm setter in the development space. I would say really for decades, the UN system has defined the development space in the globe, ranging from the Human Development Index to greening development and to whole concept of fragility, peace building, and others. Development finance is long overdue for an overhaul. And this fund is a step in the right direction. To provide thought leadership from fund to fund. Having all and some here and systemic change. And and build synergies that exist. Rebuild GDP growth cannot be sustained without progress on the environmental front. Thus, not only do we need to ensure complementarity in program design, we also have to do the same with financing, and the fund must reflect this reality. The third is to capitalize on UNDP's unique role as Africa's trusted development partner and integrator. UNDP has a history as Africa's premier development integrator. This is something we must leverage for good effect. UNDP's experience and expertise and networks could be brought to bear, not as a lead institution in the traditional sense, but as a true integrator, one that shares, connects, builds, and facilitates. In Africa, we are already seeing signs of these via our vibrant accelerator labs and the ad hoc groupings that are being formed right now to lead UN country team support to African countries in the fight against COVID. Fourth and last is to build on existing socio-economic assessment that Mahmoud just referred to. As the lead UN entity on the technical front for this assessment and analysis, UNDP teams have worked seamlessly with teams, resident coordinators, to ensure their success. And in many African countries, we're seeing work across agencies involved in including also diverse colleagues and groups in consultations, framing sessions, and having supported whole of UN approaches to strategy building and development and planning. These are the green shoots of lasting change, something that must be celebrated and sustained. Mr. Chair, distinguished colleagues, recovering from a disruption that is as deep and as wide as COVID-19 in Africa requires us to think big. We must be, by necessity, become thinkers without borders. We must be ready to think way beyond our comfort zones and fully integrate inputs and capacities from the entire UN family. We must also be ready to demonstrate uncommon creativity and flexibility as the pandemic impact continues to evolve and unfold. This is why we must find ways to work together and deliver results that make a difference for every citizen. As the previous panelists said, it's about going greener, going stronger, going fairer, and going digital. I thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. You provided a great segue, not just the focus on Africa, but your last words about going greener and digital. We have the Director for Technology and Climate, actually Director for Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management Division of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, Mr. Jean-Paul Adam. The floor is yours. Unmute, please. Jean-Paul, can you unmute? Yeah. These things happen sometimes even to the technology gurus. So take your time.
Liz, is that on our side?
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
Sorry, I was trying without the earphones because sometimes it's better. But if you can hear me now, that's fine.
Much better.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So good afternoon, and thank you to all of the panelists. It's been a pleasure to participate in this event, and just to underline how important I think that this fund is, not only for funding in the UN context, but I think as a few of our speakers have already mentioned, in terms of a paradigm shift in relation to how we look at financing and how we can actually resource building back better, particularly in the context of vulnerable countries. Africa is perhaps one of the most vulnerable regions. It's vulnerable to climate change, and 3 to 5% of GDP being lost annually. And we don't realize that because it's happening every year. African governments are having to respond to droughts, to natural disasters, and they're already spending 3 to 5% of GDP. It's something that's happening immediately, and the impact is as substantial as the threat that we're facing from COVID. And as we respond, we must look at the response as a development response, as one which builds resilience and reduces that vulnerability. And this is where the element of resources for these particularly vulnerable countries, which includes small island states, it includes countries that have very narrow resource base and have very limited fiscal space. And even before COVID-19 had made an appearance, Africa was growing on average at just over about 3%, which, while is generally good globally, it would not be sufficient to target SDGs. And the financing gap, to put it in context of how much financing is actually needed, the estimates done by the UNEC had shown that there was an estimated $63.8 billion required in annual financing for 10 years to meet the SDGs. But with COVID-19, that gap has actually grown by a further 29 billion. So the gap is now actually 92.8 billion, which it gives you an element of the scale. And if we put that as well in the context of climate change adaptation, where again, financing has been hard to come by, the UNEP Adaptation Finance Gap Report has estimated that 140 to 300 billion dollars in adaptation financing would be needed by 2030. Now, that's over 6 times to 13 times greater than what the international public financing for climate change is available today. So the gaps are huge. Those gaps are to further widen, and this has an impact as well on addressing inequalities. So how can we look at the SDG fund as a lever in relation to, for example, blended finance models, and recognizing that official financing is under pressure, the treasuries around the world are struggling to meet their existing commitments. There are challenges for raising additional taxation. How do we deal with this in this current environment? Of course, we need more official financing. We need governments to meet their commitments, but we also need to look at how we can blend with private sector financing and attract a lot of the financing that, for example, is already happening in the developed world, but basically de-risk it so that it can be accessible to extremely vulnerable countries. So the SDG Fund is an ideal facility that can be used, for example, to prepare projects that can risk or bring an element of de-risking for these projects for private financiers, or linking as well as part of blending with some official funds towards unlocking financing from, for example, pension funds and others. Now, if we take an example of one of the projects that has been approved by the SDG Fund in Africa, in Gabon, this is an SDG Fund project for about $1 million upfront funding, and to prepare nature-based solutions using an ecosystem approach for long-term wealth creation by reinforcing protected areas, including around forests, and creating jobs that will be associated with protecting the resource and moving towards more renewable energy and reducing Gabon's overall dependence, for example, on fossil fuels, and having such a narrow resource base, and therefore it's linked as well to the development of ecotourism. There's an opportunity funds to then create a format which could attract investment into a green bond facility, for example. And there are opportunities for green or blue bond financing across Africa, where we look at nature-based solutions that can be financed as part of a wider trend where funds can be directed, for example, into renewable energy or into water-based projects or into agriculture and food-based solutions towards addressing the SDGs. And one example that has actually been done in my former role, I was a former member of the Seychelles government, and we had actually done a blue bond at that point, where we leveraged a guarantee from the World Bank to be able to reduce the cost of financing for restructuring of the fisheries sector along sustainable guidelines. So to conclude, I think what we're looking at in terms of the SDG Fund platform that can allow further in key areas. One of the other areas that the ECA has been working with other international partners on is on a liquidity and sustainable financing facility, which would essentially be backed by equity from OECD central banks. And again, that equity from the OECD central banks will essentially provide that security, which will reduce the cost of overall financing and be blended with official financing. And this can allow the injection of capital in the immediate, and it can finance green recoveries in the medium to long term. And it can also refinance unsustainable debts and therefore create more fiscal space for governments to really invest in the SDGs. And this is linked to the importance, therefore, of aligning national development programs with the SDGs and ensuring that there is that accountability between the investments that are being made, for example, through these type of financing. And this is where the SDG Fund has preparation around accountability and transparency, and the linkages with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement can be ensured. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share a few of these ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jean-Paul, for sharing these practical ideas, and I think that you are seeing with a value in the field and with good impact, and this is actually a good reflection of what the fund is doing and can be doing more in the future. I don't know if Lisa and colleagues have been following the updates on the chat. There have been some good suggestions and some good ideas and problems actually as well highlighted that could be considered for the fund going forward. So yeah, we finished now with the our time, and we have few minutes, exactly 7 minutes for interventions from the floor, and perhaps very quick seconds of reaction from the panelists if they want to react to any of what they have heard, either from their fellow panelists or from the comments from the floor. So I understand that we have Mr. Christian
Actually,
Salazar.
Mahmoud, I see one question for the panelists from Mr. Diego Alexander Foss, which is regarding interaction with private investors and how the panelists see the potential for releasing potential private funding during COVID-19 and at a time when the private sector is bleeding due to the economic consequences of the pandemic, which I think is a really solid reality check for this dream. So I would love to from the panelists. So invite others to please type in your questions into the Q&A.
About possible partnerships with the private sector. I saw Felix raising his hand first. So Felix?
Yeah, very quickly, I think we need to distinguish what is the private sector and what are private investors. The private sector, yes, I do agree with the question. It's a very difficult moment. And I don't think the private sector needs to be giving a lifeline in order to keep on going. But one thing is the private sector, let's say the producing consuming private sector, and a different story is the big private investors, the financial and institutional investors. It's those we need to bring on board, is those who need to bring to countries like Jamaica or like others. And in so doing, we need to find that what they are looking for in many of these institutional investors, the European Commission is starting to talk to asset managers, big pension funds. Many of them are starting to ask, where can I find good projects where I can raise my, let's say, green portfolio level, and projects that I don't know about because they are not in my circuit. How do I get projects in these countries in the circuit? And one of the, let's say, not very easy answers to the question is, in many countries, the financial markets are not producing internally these projects. So it's very difficult for the international investors in the international markets to find these projects. This is the link that is missing right now between the trillions of investment in financial jurisdictions out there in financial centers and the projects in countries that exist that are good and that people would love to know about. And that's, I think, one of our intentions, is to try to work not only on de-risking, but also try to work about bringing these people to understand what are they investing in and attract them to invest over there.
Right. One of the points raised earlier by Courtney is the state of doing business in developing economies and emerging markets. While he focused on the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, but the case is still very much there if we follow the doing business report. And it's basically the issue of getting the private sector ready to engage. It's fine. We see the enthusiasm, willingness by the private sector in different sizes, including the small and medium enterprises, to engage. But the business environment, if it is overwhelmed by unnecessary regulations, obstacles, hurdles to or to deal with the governments and regulation, that could be an issue. I wonder if this is one of the areas that Lisa and her colleagues are considering, like helping governments in providing support for the business sector through better regulation, competitive policy. Courtney?
Yeah. Before Lisa comes in, I just want to underscore how important I think that point is that you and Felix made. Obviously, we have as developing countries put a lot of emphasis on securing public international capital, but obviously public and private flows, capital flows, obey a different logic and respond to different incentives. And the strategy has been for private capital to be directed to low-income countries. We have need for them credit enhancement to de-risk these investments. And Felix is absolutely right. I mean, de-risking is fine. Credit enhancements and guarantees are okay for what they're trying to do. It cannot be a long-term solution, though. I mean, you can't, dress up the project risk, the foreign exchange risk, the political risk, and just say, listen, we're going to give you an incentive to put your money in these countries, without saying to these countries like mine, listen, there are some structural things that you need to work on in terms of improving your enabling environment. The Americans have a kind of a crude expression, lipstick on a pig. No matter how much you dress it up at the end of the day, it's not a sustainable approach to just look at de-risking instruments. You have to say to countries like mine have to understand that we have to do the heavy lifting with respect to our enabling business environment and in achieving macroeconomic stability and all the hard things that we need to do. There's just no getting away from that. So I just wanted to make that clear, because too much times in these sort of discussions, you hear about what developing countries need in terms of external finance, and not enough about what we need to do in terms of making the large structural deep-seated reforms that we need to do in order to attract those private flows.
Right. Before I give the floor to Lisa, perhaps toward the very end to react and to wrap it up, I'd like just to ask if the panelists have any kind of comments not just related to the government or the public-private partnerships, but that missing third pillar, which was highlighted by Professor Raghu Rajan, the former chief economist of the IMF and the former governor of the Bank of India, is about the missing pillar, the role of community. So when you do the partnerships, yes, it's the government, yes, it's the private sector, but we see the growing role as well of community and how can we empower the community to be a conducive and supportive partner to reform and to change. Any reactions to that from the field, from John Paul or from Ahuna? In a few seconds. We have only 1 minute left for all good lines of wisdom.
Oh, Jean Paul wants to go, so go first, Jean Paul.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you to everyone. I think that definitely there are funds available. There are huge pension funds that are looking for areas to invest, and there's a mixture of factors. There are some countries that are particularly fragile. There's the
We lost you, Jean Paul.
For example, the foreign exchange risk. And can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. I think firstly we need to recognize we need counter-cyclical funding. So for that funding to come in the immediate in countries that are extremely vulnerable, there needs to be some form of de-risking guarantees and so on. And there's no way around that. We need that in the immediate. And we have to package that as part of the long-term improvement of the framework within those countries, which is obviously around regulations. But it's also about having facilities that countries can tap into as a matter of course, not having to
joining in
negotiate.
seconds. Joining in seconds.
Yes. So I think it's a mixture of the immediate counter-cyclical investments and the preparing the road for a green recovery, which every country can access funds in a quick and efficient manner. Thank you.
Just word to add there about small, medium enterprises on the question of private sector. I think at least in Africa, I guess it goes for other areas. This is where the largest happens, and yet it is the most neglected when it comes to financial disposition. So I think that's one of the changes that need to occur. And also looking at the space of informality, the bulk of all the community that you refer to are operating within an informal sector. Yes. And that informal sector is also not brought into the debate in terms of how you capacitate and take care of that sector and fold it into the formal. So the integration, basically is a transition from a financially driven economy to a people economy.
Right, thank you so much. Well, Lisa, you have a few seconds to say thank you, perhaps.
Mahmoud, we do have Christian Salazar who's joining us from Latin America. I'm afraid he was under a different name.
All right.
Do you just want to come in quickly with your intervention?
Well, I have to stop now, okay, Lisa, I'm afraid, because I'm chairing another panel. So I'm afraid I have to leave you all now. Thank you for your great intervention. And I'll leave it to Lisa to wrap it up. And please forgive me because I have to chair.
Okay.
And they called me like 10 times from the HLPF. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mahmoud.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Christian, can you hear me or are you there?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Christian, would you like to make your quick intervention? I'm sorry that we didn't know you were under a pseudonym today. So
yes, I mean, I will be really very, very short so we can all wrap this up. Yes. Just to give a very brief flavor of what is being discussed on these issues among the resident coordinators in Latin America, because as you probably all well know, Latin America and the Caribbean is the region in the world hardest hit by COVID-19 in terms of economic forecast, recession. And so we really see a real risk that COVID-19 will propel us 20 on several MDG and SDG achievements in the continent. So when we discuss SDG achievement and SDG financing today, it's closely linked to the effectiveness of the socio-economic response on COVID-19. And here we are just 30 countries and territories right now are finalizing, we have finalized their vulnerability assessments. And I think trying to identify those most vulnerable groups, and that's an important basis, the RCs thinks, for governments, but also for donors and the funds to take decisions on how to allocate funding. And the second important piece is what was mentioned by several panelists. MICs and SIDS face serious vulnerabilities due to COVID-19, and they also face huge barriers to access fresh money. And somehow this pandemic must lead to a review of the criteria, of the classical criteria for funding allocation, because income per capita to determine the risk of any country to suffer a massive socioeconomic setback from COVID and massive backslide on the SDGs. So what the RCs in the region are proposing is a kind of a special policy funding window for middle income countries and SIDS in the SDG funds and others, to allow them now to prevent those backslides and to link the short-term economic response with the longer-term agenda. Some of the topics were mentioned by the panelists, so I won't go into detail, but really, this is about prevention, really, and to do those links now, particularly as MICs and SIDS face these huge challenges in accessing funding. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, and thanks for giving me the floor still, though we are over time.
Sure. No, thank you, Christian, and really critical to have a global perspective as we talk about the impacts and how a vehicle like the Joint Fund can be relevant to all countries that are suffering. I think it's my job now to just say sincere thanks to our esteemed panelists. We really appreciate you taking the time. Your interventions are valued, your insights are valued, your leadership on these issues, and we really appreciate your support to the Joint SDG Fund. We also want to thank our I think at one point we were at 275 participants, so we want to thank everyone tuning in from the field, from many of our country teams, NGO partners, civil society. We really appreciate having all those voices tuning in. We'll try to make this more regular, because I see a great demand for more open conversations. So we'll be in touch. We will be kicking off our virtual roadshow at the General Assembly with some private equity CEOs and our Deputy Secretary General. So we look forward to keeping you updated on the activities of the Joint SDG Fund. So thank you again, everyone. Stay well, stay healthy, and have a beautiful summer in isolation. Okay, all the best.
Thank you.
All right, stay well.